James Klug here. The Telegraph recently released an article stating trans women's, or biological men's, milk is as good as breast milk. This is the position of the NHS and CDC despite no long-term studies on its effect on children. So today...
Wait, what? What are you talking about? What is this? Who are you? Hang on a second. This is, okay. I think I have the wrong clip. I'm very sorry about that. Just give me 2 seconds to fix the issue. What's up, YouTube? I don't think I need to explain what we're doing today, but here's an explanation anyway. My goal here was to address all pro-abortion arguments I could find, even the crazier ones. I'm not entirely sure if I've succeeded in that sense, but I at least hope I've addressed the most important ones. Let me know in the comment section if I've missed any or you think one of the arguments I have addressed still stands. Also, I've saved the most important argument for last, so stick around.
The whole debate on abortion rests upon when the fetus becomes a human. As someone who draws the line at about 20 weeks, I refuse the analogy from the get-go because a clump of cells isn't a child.
I want to clarify something here. The way I'm supposed to address this objection depends largely on
what do you mean by
human. I believe that when most pro-choice people use this argument, they don't necessarily mean that the fetus is not a human in the sense of it belonging to a different species or not having human DNA. I think that in reality, they're trying to transmit the idea the fetus is not a fully developed individual, a person with unique personality and identity. It's just a tiny organism, an almost unrecognizable clump of cells. But if they do mean that, the rebuttal is easy because the fetus has human DNA and it's an individual organism separate from that of the mother, so by definition, it's a human. If they mean it's not a person instead, well, let's address that, shall we?
The thing that we're interested in protecting is the human conscious experience. Whenever we talk about a person, we're not usually talking about a body or a collection of cells. We're talking about some other conscious sentient being. Whenever we're talking about pain, suffering, harm, happiness, joy, any of these emotions, we're usually talking about somebody that can experience them as such. When we look at the end of life, the instructive moment is when the person no longer has or is capable of having a conscious experience. So I think when we look at the beginning of life, we should also start at the same point, which is when that conscious experience forms. So my argument is abortion should be illegal at the moment that the fetus is capable of having all of the parts communicating that can deploy said conscious experience, which I've read is anywhere from 20 to 28 weeks. So legally, I say probably at about 20 weeks would be the safe point to start protecting that person that's now developed in the womb.
This is a clip from a debate Destiny's had with Trent Horn on abortion, and what you've just heard is Destiny's whole position on the abortion issue. We should protect fetuses only past the 20-week mark, because that's roughly the moment when they begin to develop consciousness, so become persons. The argument may seem to hold some water at a first glance, but only at the first glance. In reality, it's nonsensical and contradictory, because what the argument actually says is, I'm willing to protect human consciousness only after it has formed, not before. The problem, of course, is that we know it will form. Taking the best case scenario of a pregnancy that will reach term, which is also the expected scenario in modern times, we know with 100% certainty that the baby will develop consciousness. In this context, killing it before that 20-week threshold contravenes the stance I value human consciousness. Because if you did, you wouldn't have killed the baby and thus prevent human consciousness from forming, right? Plus, Destiny here treats human consciousness as a process that begins at the 20-week mark, because he admits that a 20-week-old fetus doesn't have the same level of consciousness that a 3-year-old baby or a grown adult has. This means that he isn't only willing to protect consciousness, but the development of consciousness as well past the 20-week mark. Except there's a problem. Consciousness begins to form at conception. Every biological change that the zygote undergoes will inevitably lead to one, out of many of course, outcomes, the emergence of consciousness. Human consciousness requires a lot of moving parts to exist, such as a human DNA, a human brain, and a living human body. Without these, there is no human consciousness, and if you value human consciousness, you need to value humans as living organisms to begin with. Just like if you value cakes, you understand that you need to value the raw ingredients, each in their separate bowls, and not only the uncooked cake that you've placed in the oven. That may indeed be the moment the cake begins to form consciousness, but there would have been no conscious cake to begin with, absent of those initial and raw ingredients. If anything, I would say that this is a common sense observation. So this argument goes.
You're not killing a life because outside of the womb, it can't provide for itself. If you were to kill us, yeah, you're killing a human viable life. But if you were to take the clump of cells at 10 weeks out of the woman's body, it can't defend itself.
Yeah, she was all over the place, wasn't she? The main point she's trying to express is that the fetus isn't worth protecting because it's not self-sustainable. If you take it outside of the woman's body, it will die, which obviously means it has no right to life. Except it's not obvious because the born child isn't self-sustainable either. The 1-week-old isn't. The 2-year-old isn't. Some adults aren't either, yet we're not supposed to kill them. We're not supposed to kill them, right? I've heard this argument before, and always, without exception, the one making the argument will clearly differentiate between the unborn fetus and the born child, despite neither being self-sustainable. And they argue their position with, if you take the fetus out of the woman's body, it will not survive on its own. The born baby is capable of surviving on its own. Not indefinitely because it will eventually starve, for instance, but it can survive for some time. This means that the thing they're valuing in a born child that the fetus lacks is nothing more than the ability to breathe. That's it. That's all the baby needs to survive outside the womb for that some time period that they're referring to. The self-sustainability argument cannot possibly refer to the ability to provide for oneself, because like I said, newborns can't either, as well as many adult individuals. So the argument has to refer to the ability to breathe, which is amazing. It's amazing because it implies that you do not deserve the right to life if you can't breathe on your own. And I have no idea how you can justify this position other than because I say so. Because as a society, we care for those who cannot take care of themselves, or have physical problems that cause them to depend on others. We have a lot of people who are not self-sustainable, both in the sense of cannot provide for themselves, and in the sense of cannot breathe without assistance. Yet, we don't strip them of their right to life, do we? For some reason, pro-choice proponents apply a different standard to fetuses. And because it's unjustified, this objection goes.
What I say and what my morals are shouldn't affect someone else who had a different upbringing as mine. I think for the people that don't consider it a living thing, they should be given the option to have an abortion. But the people that consider it a living thing don't get it.
This is one of the more idiotic arguments, and I'm not saying this as an insult. The point is that you can't have a society where everybody lives according to their own morals and standards. That may be the case in some aspects, but definitely not all. That's because the very concept of a society implies the idea that people need to find common values to guarantee social cohesion. Like I said, not necessarily in all aspects, but at a minimum in terms of the fundamental ones. For instance, we need to agree as a society to ban murder, stealing, rape, corruption, and any other behavior that is incompatible with a stable and thriving society. So in reality, what this guy here is saying isn't I believe morality is subjective and you can't enforce your moral values on others. Rather, his argument is I believe morality is subjective and you can't enforce your view on abortion on others. Because I guarantee he's okay with enforcing some moral values on people like the ones I've already mentioned. Just not this particular one. This means that his pro-abortion stance is based on special pleading, which makes his entire position fallacious. This objection goes.
There's one sperm or one egg. What's more different? The one sperm and the one egg to the zygote, or the zygote to the 9-month fetus?
They are different in a myriad of ways. So,
Sure, but your argument, you're saying that that 9-month fetus is more in common with the single cell zygote than a sperm or an egg has with a single cell zygote.
What Destiny is implying here is that the zygote is closer in value to the sperm or the egg than the 9-month baby, and he bases that view on, well, intuition. Because the zygote looks more like the sperm and the egg than the 9-month baby. So he's comparing and ascribing value to these three things based on how they look physically, when the real value difference between them comes from their nature. The sperm and the egg are body parts, whereas the zygote and the 9-month baby are bodies. They are human bodies in different developmental phases. This shows that intuition isn't exactly the best way to make moral decisions, or any type of decision for that matter, and it's definitely not valid basis for a pro-abortion argument. This one goes to... Yeah, you didn't see this one coming, did you?
Okay, so what if somebody isn't financially able to take care of a kid and they are forced to have one, and now the kid has a bad childhood, grows up bad, and then now they have all this trauma and they become a murderer?
You can't use this argument to support abortion, just like I can't use the following argument to oppose abortion. What if the kid's bad childhood actually inspires him to grow out of it and motivates him to educate himself? Next thing you know, he becomes a second Einstein and changes the world for the better forever. Both of these arguments are bad. We need to take a stance based on the information we already have about the situation we're discussing and keep hypothetical outcomes as irrelevant as possible, especially when said hypotheticals stretch across decades. And the information we have right now is simple. The mother wants the freedom to kill the unborn child, no matter the reason. There's very little room for what ifs. I would say there is none unless we have a crystal ball and we can determine the fetus's future with such accuracy that we would be completely justified in choosing one stance over the other. Do you have one? Because I don't. This one goes to...
Pregnancy in itself is a very serious medical condition that has physical, mental, emotional, and financial burdens for the pregnant person.
Yep.
And to force a person to endure that experience against their will is simply immoral, and it's belittling the experience that pregnancy is.
Let me ask you this. Is it okay for the mother to kill a 2-year-old child because the stress the child puts her through is too much for her to handle? The answer is no, because no matter the intensity of the mother's discomfort, the killing is never justified. At which point you could argue, yeah, but she doesn't need to kill the child as she has other options, such as have other people take care of the child. That option doesn't exist with the pregnant mother because she's the only one who can carry that pregnancy. To which I will reply that the reason the mother is not allowed to kill the child in the first case isn't because she has other options available, but because, I'll say it again, no matter the intensity of the mother's discomfort, the killing is never justified. How does this moral value suddenly change just because the situation forces the mother in the role of the primary caretaker, especially when that situation only lasts for a maximum of 9 months? The answer is, it doesn't. This objection goes to...
You don't have a uterus. You don't have a say in this debate. There is no debate for you here. If you are in a relationship with somebody and she is pregnant and she chooses to have an abortion, that is a discussion that she should have with you. At that point, that is a time that you should have an opinion. At any other time, you do not have a right to dictate what happens to anybody else's body.
You don't have a penis. You don't have a say in this debate. There is no debate for you here. If you're in a relationship with somebody and he's a racist and he chooses to rape a 3-year-old child, that is a discussion that he should have with you. At that point, that is the time that you should have an opinion. At any other time, you do not have the right to dictate what happens to anybody else's body. I won't insult your intelligence by assuming you need additional clarifications, so I'll just let this one marinate here instead. This objection goes.
The life starts at birth. Life starts at the first breath.
Actually, life doesn't begin at first breath. If you look up when does human life begin scientifically, it'll say fertilization.
Life does not begin at fertilization.
Let's ignore the fact that she said the baby only becomes alive with his first breath outside of the womb. That would be the more extreme version of the objection she's presenting, and I want to attack the Stillman version of it, which is the notion that no matter when life begins, it definitely doesn't happen at conception. And I think you cannot make this claim without first defining the concept of being alive. Because once you have the definition of being alive, only then can you work to separate living from non-living human beings based on your definition. We're not talking about the state of being alive in terms of universal standards, because there may exist beings that we cannot recognize as alive by the same metrics we apply to humans or any of the creatures we already know to exist. So we need to define the concept of being alive with respect to the known. This definition will change once we discover a being that doesn't conform to the definition but is still alive. And the problem I keep seeing is pro-choice people trying to separate between living and non-living beings based on the functionality of one organ. It's sometimes several organs, but typically just one, which is why they invoke either the heartbeat, the first breath of air, so the lungs, the development of the brain, or the emergence of consciousness, which also falls in the brain category. Out of all of these, I think the brain argument holds the most water because we recognize that people are alive even if their hearts stop beating or their lungs don't work anymore, but we do consider them technically dead if they no longer have a brain or they're brain dead. However, the brain argument doesn't hold either when it comes to the zygote, because although the zygote may not have a brain yet, it will grow one. And we know of only one type of organism that grows functioning body parts, a living one. This leads us to another definition for the concept of being alive, which I believe is more fitting and all-encompassing. The state of an organism that grows and matures over time as a result of cellular activity. And the zygote is precisely that. The zygote is in a conducive environment and, when given enough time and nutrients, it will grow, evolve and mature. If the nutrient pipe is cut off the zygote, guess what? It becomes dead. I believe that the medical term is non-viable, but that's just a euphemism for the organism was once alive, but is now no more. It's dead. Based on this definition, the zygote is most definitely alive, because otherwise it wouldn't be able to grow and evolve. Dead organisms don't do that. There is no other reasonable definition for the concept of being alive, or at the very least I haven't heard any, which means that the only reasonable position is that life begins at conception. Just to preempt it, yes, the sperm is also alive, but that doesn't mean it should have human rights. And this isn't special pleading, rather it's the result of recognizing the fact that we shouldn't imbue the fetus with human rights merely because it's alive, but because it's alive and human. The sperm is alive, but is not a human, it's a human body part. We've already talked about this. This objection goes to.
Okay, this is a kind of a moral question. Do you guys both eat meat?
I do, yes.
You do? Okay.
Yep.
So what is the fundamental biological difference between eating a sentient cow versus aborting a fetus?
The moral difference between a cow and a fetus is the human status. As a society, we treat humans differently because we realize that humans are different. But to answer this from my perspective, I place humans higher on the moral scale than any other animal because I am a human myself. And I want all humans to have the same perceived moral value because that minimizes the risk of the society taking away my moral value in the future for any unjust reason, e.g. I'm male, I'm white, I'm European, I'm below 7 feet, you name it. As to why I would like unborn humans to have the same rights, well, that's because they're humans and my position forces me to be morally consistent. Because if we use special pleading to strip unborn humans of rights, is it okay to do the same for people above the age of 70? How about those with an IQ lower than 100 points? How about for black people? A system that promotes equality among all humans needs to include unborn ones as well, because there's no objective value difference between a born and an unborn human. If there is, I'd like to hear it. As to why I insist for animals to stay lower than humans on the moral scale, I don't. My point is that they already are lower than humans on the moral scale and they've always been that way. This means that we actually need a reason to upgrade them to the human status instead of one not to. If that answers that, this objection goes.
I'm going to ask you one question.
Yeah, I'll do my best to answer it. Yes.
You have an 11-year-old daughter.
I do have an 11-year-old daughter.
Okay.
She's across the street.
So she just got brutally and what would you do?
We have two vantage points here. The first is the argument that no matter the process by which the pregnancy has occurred, the unborn child still has the right to life. I understand the brutal nature and effects of rape on the mother, and I understand that even the existence of the baby can contribute to that, as the mother will inevitably associate the baby with the image of the It still doesn't matter, and this doesn't come from a place that lacks empathy towards the mother, but one that expresses empathy towards the mother as well as the child. Both the mother and the child are innocent in this scenario, and they both require support and assistance. If you argue that abortion is justified in cases of rape, you're arguing that a child loses its right to life based on how the act of procreation occurred, and I don't see how anyone can make that case. The second vantage point is the one saying that using exceptions like rape to take a stand against the pro-life position as a whole means you've already lost the debate. Because even if your argument does convince me, it only convinces me that I should be okay with abortion in rape cases. I'll still be against it in any other case. Which is fine if this is your actual goal, except as I've already shown, the rape argument isn't convincing anyway. So this objection goes too.
Quick summary is that essentially each person is sovereign over their body. You don't have a right to use anybody else's body without their consent. And so if a fetus, even if you were to say that a fetus is a person, if you were to say that it gets to use somebody else's body without their consent, you are now in the position of granting special rights to fetuses that no other person has.
For people that aren't aware of it, the classical violin apprenticeship, musicianship society has kidnapped a poor lady, stuck her in bed, and when she wakes up, she realizes that her kidneys are attached to the world's greatest violin player. And they tell her, listen, ma'am, you have to remain in bed for 9 weeks, otherwise the world's best violin player is going to die. And then the question is, does this lady have a right to unplug herself, or does she have a moral obligation to sit there and, you know, basically use her kidneys to clean the blood of this world's greatest violin player, even though she didn't consent to being stuck in that situation? That's like the classic violin argument from Thompson's paper, right?
Just a clarifying note here, the violin argument is Matt's argument, not Destiny's. It just so happened that it's Destiny who presented the argument during this debate instead of Matt. So let's hear what Destiny has to say in response to the violin argument, and then we'll comment on it.
Going back to this 2013 paper by the Steve Wagner guy, he posits Mary's cabin. So a woman wakes up and she finds out that she is in a blizzard. She's locked in a cabin for 6 weeks and she'd just given birth to a baby. She wakes up, she looks over for everything, finds a note, and it says, listen, your child is in another place and it's safe. There's another child in another room. You have all the food and supplies that you need, but for 6 weeks, you're going to be locked in this cabin, and that baby's with you. You're there. We'll let you out in 6 weeks. Everything will be okay. In 6 weeks, the police show up to the house. They plow all the snow. They open the door. Mary comes out, and they say, oh, my goodness, we've got you. The Association of Behavioral Psychologists kidnapped you for an experiment. We're so sorry. We're going to bring you out. How are you guys doing? And she says, I'm doing fine. And they're like, well, how's the baby? And she says, they're not here anymore. And the question is, what happened to the baby? And she says, oh, well, I let the baby starve. I didn't want to feed it. I'm like, well, you had all the means and opportunity to. You were the only one that could have. The question is did she have an obligation to provide nourishment for the child while she was there and the only one that could? And I feel like this is a closer analogy to pregnancy than the violin argument, because you were the only one that could provide nourishment to that child for those 6 weeks. Couldn't be any random person's kidney there. You have the ability to do it. We would have to breastfeed, right? So it's some obligation to your body to use it in a way that's like kind of natural. Breastfeeding is more natural than hooking people's kidneys up to each other. And I feel like when most people look at this, and I am relying a bit on moral intuition here, I do admit, but I'm looking at this de facto guardianship idea. I don't think most people would be comfortable saying like, well, it's not her kid, and yeah, if she really wanted you to just kind of chill there and let the kid starve, it's okay because, that kid doesn't have a right to her body. I think people would say, well, in that case, she's the only one that can provide it. She does have not just a moral, virtuous action, but like an actual moral duty and moral obligation there to provide for the safety and the nourishment of that child. If I went to the pool and I was just sitting there, hanging out, having a smoke, whatever, and a kid walks next to me and he just falls in and he's drowning, and all I have to do is reach over and kind of like pick him up and put him aside, and I just sit there and I watch him die, I may not be a murderer, but I think ubiquitously people would condemn me as not taking action. They wouldn't say, well, it would have been virtuous for you to pick the kid up. They would say, no, you have a moral obligation there because you are the only person in that situation that could have provided life-saving treatment to this person, and it's not going to put you into the way of like fatal harm.
What Destiny's analogies showed is that there are plenty of other cases where born humans get those special rights, as Matt calls them. There are plenty of other cases where your right to bodily autonomy is not more important than someone else's life. And in those situations, those people do have a right to your body, which is only natural in a society created by social animals with the goal of cooperating with each other for the betterment of all. which means that when Matt says this,
even if you were to say that a fetus is a person, if you were to say that it gets to use somebody else's body without their consent, you are now in the position of granting special rights to fetuses that no other person has.
it's actually him who does special pleading by granting born humans rights that unborn fetuses lack. This means that the idea of de facto guardianship, if it applies anywhere, it applies in the case of pregnancy. So this objection goes too. I don't want to bore you too much with it because you probably already know where I stand after watching the video, but I do want to mention two things really quick. The first one is that I too was once pro-abortion, or pro-choice, however you want to call it. It wasn't until I got more in-depth understanding of the various pro and con arguments and dove deeper into morality and logical argumentation that I finally understood the flaws of my position. It didn't happen overnight, but that was to be expected. We rarely change our minds overnight, especially when it's about our core beliefs that we're deeply invested in preserving. Humans are prone to biases and tribalism because these make us feel comfortable and give us the illusion of knowledge and control. So the only way to escape this trap is to become intellectually honest with yourself and analyze your ideas and values objectively with a cold and unbiased approach, however uncomfortable that may be. The second point is the disappointment coming with the realization that pretty much all anti-abortion arguments come with religious justifications. It seems like nobody can counter-argue the pro-choice position other than through religious reasoning, which I believe will always fail at achieving anything aside from more division and tribalism. It makes no sense to argue that abortion is bad because all people are made in the image of God and have the same innate value if your opponent doesn't believe in God and doesn't adhere to your religious moral system to begin with. You'll never build a bridge so long as you're arguing from an entirely different paradigm. For your argument to work, you must first convince them that your religion is true and that God exists, which is obviously easier said than done considering that people have been arguing over religious truths pretty much since the dawn of time. So the next best thing is to create arguments that transcend all biased systems of thought, whether they are religious, personal, social, and so on. And that's what I tried to achieve today, which I think I have.
Guess when someone's wrong, they never know how.
See you in the morning.
Yeah.